Hello, welcome to the self-learning platform by Dr. Sushma Singh. Today we start Unit 5, Types of War, Conventional War, Limited War, and Nuclear War. And we start with regional conflicts. One of the important dimensions of conventional war in the nuclear age is the concept of regional conflicts that were either supported directly or indirectly by the superpowers. One may look at two types of such conflicts: one that have seen an indirect intrusion by an extra regional power, and one that has a super great power in direct confrontation with the regional power. One may consider some selective causes in this context. At the first level, one may include wars of the Middle East and wars fought by India with China and Pakistan. At another level, one would have to consider wars fought by super or great powers against smaller powers like Falkland conflict and Iraq War 1990 and 2003 respectively. Middle East had seen several wars between the Arab states and Israel. The first of the war took place at the time of the creation of the State of Israel in 1948, followed by the wars of 1967 and 1973. The United States has been a traditional supporter of Israel. This support has come in terms of armament, logistics support, and finances. The Arab states have had Soviet support during the wars. Egypt and Syria, in particular, had benefited from Soviet support in their fight against the Israelis. The case of Indo-Pakistani wars is, in a sense, similar. While one may not have seen an explicit American and Soviet support in the wars of 1947-48 and 1965, the 1971 war did see a clear positioning of the American and the Soviets. The American tilted towards Pakistan, as articulated by President Nixon of the United States, and the Indo Soviet Treaty of Peace, Friendship, and Cooperation 1971 symbolized respectively the interest of the superpowers in the subcontinent. But India had also benefited from American help in 1962 war with China. At another level are wars fought by great powers against small powers. The Falklands War between the British and Argentina is one such example. The issue at stake was the island of Falkland that was under the British trusteeship and was taken over by Argentina. The Argentinian argument had been that it was a part of the process of decolonization, while the British argued that the Falkland Islanders were to be given the right to self determination and eventual independence. The key features of all these was the local or regional nature of its geopolitical scope. The wars did not spill over into a global confrontation within a Cold War framework. Now let us discuss limited war. Ever since the World War, it was assumed that the war would always be a total war. In the age of nuclear weapons, especially during the years of nuclear monopoly of United States, this perception was expressed as a policy of massive retaliation. Eventually, with both the United States and the Soviet Union having emerged as nuclear weapon powers, deterrence became the key to security policy of these countries. The logic of deterrence was based on the idea of mutual vulnerability to attack. To put it simplistically, a possible strike by one country would be countered by a retaliatory strike by the other. This capability of the retaliatory strike was to prevent the first country from striking in the first place. However, the Korean War 1950 to 53 showed that the existence of nuclear weapons and deterrence on both sides of the Cold War leaders did not prevent a conflict between the two Cold War rivals. It was true that the conflicts did not involve the two superpowers in a direct state of confrontation, but their attempts at exploring and testing the determination of each other with limited rather than unlimited manner as would have been the case in the age of world wars. The war was fought with restraint and with channels of communications open to ensure that it does not escalate into a major confrontation. Thus, the age of limited war had begun. The concept of limited war, as it originally developed, focused on the conflict between the two superpowers that were fought not on their soil or directly fought in other areas of the world. Therefore, when one tries to understand the limited nature of limited war, the focus is on the abundant military power that both the superpowers have but do not actually use in such a war. How is a limited war different from a general war? The most important feature that makes limited war different from the general war is the deliberate restraint that is exercised by the warring parties in the conduct of the war. This restraint is directly related to the compatibility of the nation to fight a war. In case the capability is limited, then the restraint is not a deliberate one. It is a product of the limited capability. It is precisely because of this that the concept of limited war was used mainly in the context of wars in which the great powers were involved. They had the capability to fight an unrestricted war, but they decide not to do so for a variety of reasons that we shall see later. Logically, the nuclear doctrines that called for strategic bombing of cities would also not be applicable here. The best description would be calling it a deliberate hobbling of oneself in the conduct of war. The logical question to ask are why these limitations and how is it achieved? The first focuses on the determinants of policy, while the second on the actual process of limitations. The first one is determinants of policy. The Seminar of Capabilities and Techniques of American Armament for Limited War held in 1957 defined the war as follows. A limited war is fought to achieve a limited objective. In the achievement of this objective, a nation may be expected to plan to expend a limited amount of the national resources, and in carrying out the war it may be expected to plan to hold the war to a limited geographical area. Therefore, limited war is one that is fought to achieve limited objectives. One must understand that the restraint necessary to keep the war limited is on means and not so much on the ends. One must also understand that there is a willingness to limit the objectives because of the need to keep the war limited and not the other way round. These limitations are not because of the feeling that the objectives to be pursued through the war are relatively less important and hence the willingness to limit them. The rationale is in the problems that may arise if the war is not limited and it eventually escalates into a bigger war. It is this fear of a general war that had been a matter of great concern amongst the Western powers in the 1950s. This fear was referred to as the fear of escalation, the desire to avoid a general war that may have been a product of escalation of a limited local conflict was the central theme in keeping to the limited nature of objectives and the deliberate restraint that was sought to be exercised. One of the debates that came to be conducted in the context of the objectives of limited war was the role of force in international relations in general. The American argued that force should not be used offensively by the United States to alter boundaries, and that only that much force should be used to resist opposing forces as was necessary. The Soviets and the Chinese, on the other hand, have considered force as a legitimate instrument of policy and have justified its use for expanding the area of socialist control. These different perceptions have had an impact on the approach to limited war. Another factor that has an influence on the objectives of a limited war is domestic public opinion. In case of both the Korean War and the Vietnam War, domestic public opinion had an impact on the American approach to these wars. One may argue that the Soviet action in Afghanistan after 1979, American actions in Iraq during 1990 and 2003 had seen a similar deliberate restraint. In all these events, domestic compulsions had played a role in varying degrees. The second one is the limitation process. The limiting process of a limited war focuses on the operative dimensions of the war. The limitations of policy are seen in real terms in the limitations placed on the geography, targets, weapons, and the extent of participation by the great powers. The geographic limitations refers to the area that comes under conflict. The Korean War was restricted to the Korean Peninsula, the Vietnam War to Indochina, the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq to those countries. These wars also did not impinge on the homeland of the superpowers. Further, there was a limitation on the targets of attack. The targets were either military installations or industrial and infrastructural facilities. Except perhaps in some cases in Vietnam, the targets were not civilian population. The targets were also not beyond the geographic area of the conflict. They did not include the homeland of the United States, Soviet Union, or China. There has been a lot of debate on the question of use of nuclear weapons in a limited conflict. At one level, there was a realization that the domestic public opinion would have been extremely critical of their use in the post Hiroshima Nagasaki period. There was also the fear of escalation into the entirely uncharted area of weapon system. Three reasons have been given for the known use of nuclear weapons by the United States in Korea. First was the American military assessment that Korea was a diversionary tactic encouraged by the Soviet Union and that the real battle was to be fought elsewhere. Second was the ground assessment made that stated that there were no clear cut target for the use of such weapons. Such an assessment had depended upon the perception of nuclear weapons use as ultimate weapons of mass destruction and not as tactical weapons of small intensity. Third was the strong opposition from its ally, the United Kingdom. Today, with the emergence of tactical nuclear weapons and the possibility of restricting the fallout of a nuclear bomb to a specific geographical area, the relevance of nuclear weapons in such a conflict is bound to be discussed as a probable reality. On the issue of participation by different states, it needs to be pointed out that in so far as the two superpowers are concerned, their participation has ranged from indifference to support on to actual combat. In Indo-Pakistan wars, these countries have participated only in an extremely indirect way. This may include diplomatic pressure or economic sanctions. On the other hand, Americans have committed troops in Korea, Vietnam, and Iraq and the Soviets in Afghanistan. And the third is the concept of escalation. It is true that the central concern of a limited war is over the degree of restraint that can be exercised as has been discussed above. Yet there are many reasons why a nation may want to escalate a limited conflict. Escalation may be used as a threat to the other side of all out war. It may be done by preventing a total defeat or simply as a reaction to the possibility of the other side escalating. Herman Kahan has presented a diagrammatic pattern of escalation of a limited conflict. There are three ways to escalate. First, increase the intensity of the conflict by a quantitative increase, like attacking logistic centers, use of nuclear weapons, or attack cities. These would be stages by which the intensity of a limited war may be increased in terms of the intensity of the battle. The second way would be to widen the area of conflict. This refers to the geographic expansion of the area of conflict. The third way is to compound escalation by creating a new crisis. This would include attack on allies or attacking establishment of the enemy that are outside the boundaries of the enemy state or states. Is there a victor in a limited war? This would be a difficult question to answer since both sides are fighting with limits on their objectives and with deliberate restraint. Such wars are unlikely to have final results. General Douglas MacArthur had remarked in the context of Korean War that there was no substitute to victory. However, this statement fails to reflect the pattern of conflict in today's time. Here we want to wind up this lecture and thank you so much for your attention.